All right, welcome to today's event. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com. I am pleased to be able to welcome you to our event today all about EDI for Dynamics 365 and Dynamics AX. Our presenter today, our main presenter, is Brian Lynch, Solution Specialist for Dynamics AX and 365 from Data Masons. We're also joined by Roger Van de Zand of Data Masons, who will be participating in a little later during today's event. I want to remind you, if you do have questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A that you should see just to the right of the main presentation area. I know Roger and Brian will be making time for those. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand things off to Brian to get us started.
Well, great. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone who has taken the time to listen to this live or maybe watching this via recording. As indicated, today we're going to go through some of the challenges and different areas related to integrating EDI and specifically making some comments regarding some of the changes that Microsoft has made with the new version, specifically Dynamics 365 for operations. Now, as a brief introduction to Data Masons, our team is EDI and e-commerce platform specialists who have focused on the Microsoft Dynamics community, really going back all the way to Exapta 2.5. So over our 20 years, we have helped over 1,500 different customers, really a global deployment team and support team that are helping organizations, really meet and exceed, some of the compliance obligations that they have with EDI. I've personally been doing EDI 20 years this past July. Started off in a technical support intern kind of relationship, and really have kind of grown up in the Dynamics community and specifically with EDI. And so I'd like to share a little bit of what I'm personally seeing kind of in the market, and again, what we're kind of hearing from our customers and partners. So with that, as far as the agenda today, I would say if you have questions, definitely type those in, and we will hopefully get all those answered towards the end. But we have muted the lines, but again, we will hopefully have some time towards the end. But for the agenda, we're going to talk about some of the changes from 365, versus AX 2012 R3 and lower and some of the prior versions. Specifically, this notion of entities and the types of entities that happens, some of the do's and don'ts, so that you may, have some of that expertise. The common data services and Power Apps, SDK that's available. A brief demonstration of the Vantage Point solution, so you can kind of see a solution kind of in action. And again, we will have Q&A towards the end. So, what has kind of really changed within the environment. And so the first thing, if you're doing EDI today, there's various ways that can occur. Web form solutions, integrated solutions that, maybe you have built a customization on, or that you've invested in a commercially available solution. When you look at the latter of integrated solutions, it was very common in 2012 R3 and lower to utilize some of the Microsoft API technology, application programmer interface. And so those were things like the Application Integration Framework, or more commonly known as AIF, or the .NET Business Connector, which was really a legacy from even prior versions. Now, unfortunately, for those of you that have been using that technology or are potentially considering it to add integration, Microsoft has deprecated that feature, by taking that out, due to potentially some of the challenges. In its place, it has introduced the notion of a data entity-based integration framework. And we're going to talk a little bit at a very high level, some of the differences, some of the pros and cons that we're seeing in the market. But there also was the notion of DIXF, which really was the notion of the data import-export framework, really used primarily for initial data loads. So for instance, if you think about your initial ERP cutover, you might be loading bulk customers, items, addresses, things along those lines. Really wasn't meant for heavy data validation and some of the per partner kind of variants that an EDI has, but again, worked very well for kind of a simple mass import, kind of utility. And so these are some of the tools that, again, as you look to potentially build a solution that may be leveraged. So when you look at the notion of data entities, there's really four main types of entities, and we're going to talk high level as an introduction to that. And so the first one is just the notion of a data entity, and as you can see on the screen, it's really the view of a single source or several tables, that support, the notion of, CRUD, or create, read, update, delete. So create a sales order, update a sales order, etc. And that notion of several tables, if you think about a sales order, you have header information that may then have address information, that has terms information. You then have line items. Each of those then have, fulfillment details, etc. So behind the scenes, there really are, multiple tables that may be needing to get access to properly create, an entry such as a sales order. Now, like most platforms, Microsoft, needs to accommodate personalization, for their customers or customizations. And so as a best practice, they have introduced the notion of extended entities. And as you can see there, again, that supporting of, modifications where you're maybe adding fields or adding additional business rules. And what's nice about these is it supports the OData and DIX framework. Now, as a best practice, you don't want to overlay on top of the standard data entities because you can get into compatibility issues, etc. As you may know, Microsoft is moving more and more towards an agile methodology from a deployment and update standpoint. Currently, offering monthly releases to keep current with, new functionality, new enhancements, updates to, previous functionality. And so as you get into the notion of modifications, again, having that extended data entity approach helps to isolate, those types of conflicts. Now, you also get into the notion of composite entities, and as you can see here, really related to the DIXF. I won't go into a lot of detail here because, again, from what we see in the market, typically not used for really the notion of EDI integration. But this works well, again, that notion of the bulk load. So I have an item, I have pricing, I have, warehouse facilities, I have, customer, variants on my part number. There's usually multiple composites or pieces that will go into that main master record. And then lastly there you see kind of the aggregate entities, and again really used more for, as its name implies, aggregating data together, really good for business intelligence, BI type of applications that you may be using to do analytics, reporting, etc. So this is hopefully just a brief introduction to the notion of data entities, what they're doing, the different types that are out there as it relates to Dynamics 365. And again, all new concepts that were not there in previous versions. So if you look at the application integration framework, if you've never seen it before, it's really the notion of, again, the sales order, invoices, different transaction types that an EDI document might need to connect with. And inside of these objects, you can put in, various business rules and other components. Now, you'll see later on, the reality is for an EDI integration, there's a lot of different massaging or heavy lifting that needs to occur, and AIF out of the box really does not have some of that infrastructure. So in a integrated option, especially if you have lots of partners, lots of different documents, these are things that definitely need to be taken into account. But as its name implies, it's at least a framework. You're not starting from scratch. So you can go into a standard sales object, copy it, or configure some of the base components. And in that, you can go through, again, some of the validate, kind of some of the standard XML, as we see there, some of the transformation that potentially may need to occur. So it does give you the baseline kind of capabilities. As you go to kind of configure that, you can also get into some of the data policies that might be set up. And so, certain things that you may be doing at individual field levels, et cetera. But it's somewhat the notion of more of a configuration task, versus a heavy, programming type of task. So with the introduction of Dynamics 365 for Operations, we now move into the notion of entities and again, the entity definitions. So I will apologize here, from the size of the screen, but, instead of the individual fields, the takeaway here is we are doing somewhat comparable work. This is going to define the various fields, some of the rules around those fields, how you physically connect, with these data entities. For instance, typically you would connect with OData and using REST-based APIs to physically, invoke the data entities to, again, create, read, update, delete, transactions or entities that reside, inside of Dynamics. Now, depending on how many EDI partners, the various services that you may be using, et cetera, you still have all of the notion of how do I communicate with my partners? Do I use a value-added network? Can I communicate directly? Am I using services such as, an SBS Commerce or other, kind of hosted kind of environment. The notion of which of your partners are EDI enabled, specific records and fields and rules that need to apply. What all of this is doing is really that notion of, okay, now that you've normalized the data, how do we physically get it into and out of, Dynamics? And so with that, a few other things that I think are kind of important is this notion of common data services. And so this is leveraging some of the data entity concepts. It allows you to expose, a little bit more coding on top of these pre-existing additions. And again, if you're trying to kind of custom build something, again, these are kind of options that you may have at your disposal. So again, just making sure that there's some awareness. Now, the net result of all of that is that, again, moving to a RESTful web services is superior to a SOAP-based communication, which was used previously. I won't get into all the acronyms, but, the SOAP protocol, was used for communication. One of the downsides to that we have heard from customers and definitely have seen in conversions is the SOAP architecture was very brittle. So I think what often is referred to as a strongly typed reference, meaning that if any of the schema changed, it basically broke the integration and you had to regenerate the service. or again, you get a little bit more. With OAuth, which is a part of the authentication process, especially with how Dynamics 365 is cloud deployed, you need to be able to ensure that security is taking into account, especially the sensitive nature of some of the things that you're dealing with, orders, invoices, inventory levels, etc. Specifically, we have leveraged JSON to physically communicate with the data entities. And what we have found is it's much more compact than an XML transmission. So for instance, we have some larger customers that, when they're doing, hundreds of thousands of orders per quarter, every time that transmission goes through the internet, performance is always a consideration. And so by leveraging JSON, you get a much more compact message that is able to communicate. And with the OData, you get that timely response and flexibility. So, again, with our solution, if we've submitted, 1,000 orders, here this morning, and number 37, had a problem, we're actually able to get that information real time, based off of the web services architecture. And so it gives that real-time feedback. We're able to pull in some of the exception management details right within, for instance, our user interface, along with some of the other infrastructure that we've added. Why is that important? When you go to, troubleshoot these transactions, one of the challenges with just the, for instance, AIF framework or even, the data entity concept is that whole exception management, requeuing of transaction, reporting on transactions, etc. These are all infrastructures that you would have to build on your own. We have taken the approach of, with a commercialized solution, being able to offer that as a part of the standard package. And so overall, we feel that the performance is very strong because it gives you, again, the throughput, the high availability with the data integrity and security that today's enterprise customers, just require of their EDI systems. So if you're new to Data Masons or, started to, talk with our team, you'll find that, one of our core philosophies and approaches is really no core customizations. We believe this is very critical because, again, the nature of how you may personalize your dynamics, other solutions like warehouse management systems, etc., that you may be adding. And so EDI needs to be able to leverage all of those environments. At the same token, be flexible because Woolworths or one of the other partners has made a change that you are in a compliance obligation to keep current with. And so if you had to go through extensive customizations and recompiling, it just oftentimes would result in non-compliance. We are very much the notion of the heavy processing done outside of Dynamics, as we like to kind of say, delivering the message in a silver platter. When that EDI message comes over in, for instance, an EDIFACT format or an XML format, it's not in the native language that Dynamics understands. And so at minimum, you have to go through some transformation to convert. There may be business rules that need to be followed. I'm splitting line items. Hey, was that price correct? I'm doing unit of measure conversions. What warehouse am I going to assign this to? This order is over a certain threshold. We need to put it on hold. All of those types of things and others, the Vantage Point product is going through those business rules and helping us to automate. Again, especially in extreme volumes, I can't have an operator, quote unquote, clicking the button, to process orders or print transactions off. This is designed to be operated in really more of a lights-out, black box, type of mode, where I'm going into the system really to set up new partners, to deal with exceptions and a few of the audit reports and key performance indicators that I may be looking at. And so full automation, with error alerting and reporting is critical. Comprehensive document support, and really what we're saying here is the notion of EDI, electronic data interchange, really can mean a lot of different things to different companies. So again, globally you're going to see more EDIFACT standards. Those standards have various versions that come out. You have, for instance, ANSI X12 in North America. You have Tradecoms in certain industries in certain areas of the world. But you also have other formats, XML, flat files, CSVs, and again, the different definitions that may occur. So being able to support those various formats are important, but also the documents themselves. Most times in a relationship with, say, a customer or a supplier, you're going to do transactions like a purchase order or an invoice. But what about pricing? What about inventory levels? What about routing guides? With our solution, we natively support over 65 different integrated transactions. The other thing, too, is, again, even though it is a standard, the reality is Woolworths is different than Kohl's. They're both using the standards, but, the definition of a purchase order with its specific records and fields is different. So having a pre-built library of those various trading partner documents and requirements, for many organizations is very critical. And so, with our solution, a managed compliance, managed services offering, is a lot of times, one of the main reasons organizations partner with us. And so we have customers who really, quote unquote, don't want to spell EDI. They want our team to run the software, manage the trading partners, deal with communications, manage the exceptions, and so a full turnkey single source provider. We do that for many, many customers. We have other customers who, hey, I'd like to run the software. I just don't want to take on the technical burden. And so the notion of the mapping and the communication, that being outsourced. And then we, on the other spectrum, have customers who leverage our mapping tool so they don't have to build a integration from scratch, but yet they're taking on, the responsibilities of the mapping and keeping that current, and they always have the safety umbrella that, for our fixed fee on maps, that they can add those into their library if they ever needed assistance. And so that end-to-end support becomes very, very important. The other thing, too, whether it be, AX 2009 or whether it be Dynamics 365, today's environments require flexible deployment options. And so, not only do we support, on-premise deployments, we support third-party data center deployments. So, for instance, Microsoft Azure, would definitely be one of the more common ones. And then we also offer our own hosted option. And so, again, under our managed services where, the complete environment is being taken care of for you. And I think really the last thing, and maybe the most important thing, is, there's lots of good EDI companies out there. What sets us apart is, we're not trying to be all things to all people. It is really important to understand how Dynamics works, keeping up with the latest versions, how certain configuration options impact the integration and ultimately the EDI. We're not to the level that we're installing Dynamics and, an implementation partner. We partner with many of the top partners, for the region, directly with Microsoft Consulting Services, etc. But again, that knowledge of, the ERP as well as EDI oftentimes goes hand in hand. And so those are skill sets that we have spent a lot of, resources on to make sure that that's available to our community. So we've talked a little bit about this. In today's kind of demonstration, I'm going to focus probably more on the customer side, and so we'll go through the notion of setting a transaction up in the system and kind of working through various workflows. But again, it is important to realize, with this investment, some of the business processes that can be automated and potentially, really leveraging that Dynamics AX or Dynamics 365 environment. So third-party logistics, picking tickets, shipping advices, warehouse transfers, inventory adjustments, copies of orders that you've issued to one of your suppliers that the 3PL is going to ship. These are just some of the transactions that other Data Masons customers have helped automate, in their environment. So with that, again, this won't be a deep dive, but we did want to kind of show the audience a little bit, how the EDI integration works, with the Vantage Point solution. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign into the system here. And it does look like I may have timed out just for a second. And so I'm going to go ahead and start that back up here. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get the environment up. And what we'll do here is we're going to actually walk through kind of the life cycle of an order. And so what I have on the screen here is my implementation of Dynamics 365 and specifically sales orders that have been created. Now, again, if you bear with me, we had talked about the fact that, at the scheduling system, our EDI is going out and looking for new transactions, going through all the validation. And so the reality is my operators really did not have to do anything to physically create a sales order. And so all of that has kind of happened behind the scenes. Now that would make for one very boring overview. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and sign into the Vantage Point client. Now, to explain this a little bit, one, this is a multi-user, multi-company system. And so as a role-based system, Brian Lynch, the administrator, is able to see all of the buttons and able to go in and edit things, etc. However, Roger, our customer service representative, he may only be able to view transactions, print them off, but he's not able to actually edit trading partner settings. Now, when I first log into the system, you'll notice that I am greeted by these interactive tiles. And specifically, if we drill into something like a critical alert, in a true production environment, this tends to be 0. The mere fact that I have 1 or more means that there's an action that I need to take. In this particular case, it just so happens to be functional acknowledgments. I have documents that are overdue because I'm not trading with a live partner. But these are, followed up with emails or text messages, often directed to the appropriate person. So maybe communications might be something more IT related, a duplicate purchase order might be something more customer service related. By the way, Brian handles Kohl's, where Roger handles Woolworths. So we can get into kind of directive and some intelligence around some of those messages. Now, when we first deploy, as we talked about, we support multiple, deployment options. And so one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to say, where is our server located for Dynamics? Because again, more often that's going to be in a cloud deployment. As you may or may not know, Microsoft did release what they call a local data, or what we used to refer to as an on-premise version. So you do have those types of options available. But once we know the server and what companies within that configuration that we're connecting to, we get into the notion of our trading partner setups. And so a lot of times you're going to have many, many partners set up, and so as I begin to type, those will actually take us down. But what we're going to do here is we're going to define, the fact that, yes, this customer is EDI enabled. By the way, this customer is doing purchase orders. They're doing invoices. Here's the method of communication communication. Here's the maps that I'm going to use. Here's the business rules that I'm going to use. So for instance, maybe with this partner, I'm going to use the price that Dynamics has calculated, which is often the default. But maybe for select customers, I want to use their transmitted pricing with reporting telling me that there's a variance. So there's settings and configurations that we can get into that allows us to personalize the environment without actually having to custom code those various situations. Now, armed with that, customer information, we also get visibility to things like my part number to their part number, ship-to addresses, and other cross-reference related materials that may need to, be dealt with, when we're actually processing these transactions. So armed with this setup information, if I did want to, quote-unquote, click the button, I do have the ability to go into, over here to the left, things like the order-to-cash process, i.e. trading with customers, the quote-to-pay process, i.e. dealing with suppliers or vendors, logistics and transports, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this name is the default configuration. We can personalize this. Same thing as we can personalize kind of the menu choices. Now, I talked about the fact that we support those 60-plus transactions into and out of Dynamics. And we can actually access those, kind of from the top menu. But if I am going to go into the user interface to process, we were also mindful of kind of guiding an operator through the process. Now, in this particular case, I literally have every single option kind of turned on. The reality is in a production environment, you may have 8 or 9 of these. So, again, I've got a purchase order. I am going to send out a PO acknowledgement. I'm going to respond to a PO acknowledgement change. I've got a PO change. So again, there may be other steps in your workflow that may be different than our last customer. And so we can kind of personalize to those types of environments. But instead of clicking the button and without having this user interface open, what most of our customers are leveraging is our automation system. And so I'd like to introduce you to our scheduler capability. And so what scheduler is doing is on an automated basis is it's going through and as its name implies, it's scheduling or automating these tasks. And so we may say, go look for new sales orders every 5 minutes. We want to send invoices out, once a day at, 8 o'clock at night. So we have all these kind of options available to us. And so what's happening, and we can see some hourglass activity off here to the right, but this is going through and basically, automating some of these key processes. For instance, the PO workflow inbound. And under these workflows, I define groups of tasks. And so, for instance, communicate with the network or the direct communication, send the purchase order off to Dynamics 365, generate the audit report. Those type of tasks are grouped together in this workflow, and then they're attached to a schedule. So do it every 5 minutes, do it upon startup. We also have the notion of event-driven. So for instance, an example of that might be, wake up in the presence of a file being created in a directory. So for instance, we get involved with, not only traditional EDI, but also sometimes e-commerce integrations. And so again, the presence of an order that may be coming from the website, wake up and go ahead and start to process that in. But armed with this automation tool, the reality is we have now created that sales order inside of Dynamics as I first started my demonstration off with. But I do want to kind of take you under the covers a little bit to show you kind of what has transpired. And so what I'm going to do is look at what we call our Document Explorer. And so inside of any new transaction, and so here at my local time, we have created an order. I'm going to right-click on that order, and my business partner, sent me, raw EDI. It's really a bunch of codes that ultimately will make up a sales order with line items, etc. Now, that sales order, we have mashed up to form an XML message. And again, still, technical in nature, but you can see now, that we now have, what the codes that someone has sent over mashed up with the actual EDI standards. And so I can see, for instance, that my customer sent over a BG02. Well, what in the world is that? Well, that's a purchase order type code. And my customer sent a value of SA, which just so happens to mean standalone order. Now, the other thing about this, as you'll see, is all of this is a native data store. So if I ever needed to pull out, for instance, a department number or vendor number, I actually now have a mechanism to do this. Again, we're very strong believers in not having to force modifications to Dynamics. And so a lot of times your partners will have to track this information for what's often referred to as turnaround data. Well, instead of having to force pushing that information into Dynamics, we're actually tracking the entire transmission and now can reference that transmission specific records, specific fields to send that data back out in our mapping process. Now, besides that, you will run into situations where you just need to kind of maybe edit an order, and I need to see it as a more human-readable version. And so here, that XML representation gets into the more traditional header line item view. And so this may supplement, again, that notion that our customer sent us bad data, or I needed to see a human-readable version of it. So we do have those mechanisms as well. Now, all of our error messages are set up in a configuration table, and what I like about that is you can actually personalize. So step 1, do this, step 2, do that, step 3, do this. That's all the information that's going to show up in our F1 help or in the email notifications. But again, everything that I've just shown you was running in the background. As far as our Dynamics is concerned, when I refresh the system and I go back out and I look at, the orders that I've created, this may take a quick second here, but what's going to happen is the system has went through and we've done, things like, my part number to their part number, what warehouse do I need to assign this order to, whose pricing takes precedence. And again, there is our order that we just created. But it's entered into Dynamics as if I had keyed it in. Now, one of the other things that we like to reference, and again, we've done this without, a core customization, is we can actually access that raw EDI information, or what we call our Transaction Lifecycle Explorer right from within Dynamics. I don't even have to have the Vantage Point system loaded. But what this does, and this particular example won't show as powerfully, but a lot of times this sales order, once shipped, created this advanced ship notice, and maybe it had this PO acknowledgement, which ultimately created that invoice. So we'd actually see a running thread of all of the transactions grouped together of what has actually transpired with that transmission. We get visibility to, has a functional acknowledgement been sent out or has it been received? Maybe I need to see the actual data. And again, so we're enhancing Dynamics without having to actually customize it. So hopefully that gives you a very, very high-level introduction to, how our system is leveraging, some of these Microsoft technologies and enhancing it in regards to trading partner management, business rule automation, scheduling capabilities that really are needed to support an often EDI communication. And so with that, what we're going to do here is open it up to Q&A. And again, on the line with me, I have Roger, who is based in Sydney and has a lot of extensive EDI experience and really supply chain experience that I get the pleasure of working with, on a day-to-day basis. So with that, Roger, I don't know if we have had any questions come up in the chat, but I'll turn it over to you to see what questions we may have.
Yes, and thanks for that, Brian, and I trust you all can hear me. We do have some questions coming in on the Q&A, Brian.
Okay, great.
Some of those I'll be able to respond to, and others I will definitely need your help with the response. One of the first questions we have is, do you offer support in our local time zone? And the answer to that question is yes, we do offer local support in this time zone. And next to that, we also have extended support options, making sure we cover all your questions 24/7. Another question we have, and I'm sure we touched about that question during the presentation earlier, is can we do our own mapping? And yes, you can do your own mapping. If you have the ambition to do your own map, we can train you on our mapping tool. I do need to say that we train you on how to use our mapping tool. We do not train you how to map, but it's very relevant. So yes, you can do your own mapping, although we also realize that sometimes you will not have the resource available to do that mapping, and then we can come to in a hybrid situation where we can help your team out with that mapping. And of course, as Brian mentioned during the presentation/demonstration, we do have a growing library of existing trading partner documents available for you to use as well. Another question we have here is, and I'm going to bundle these two questions together, is we already have a solution in place with AX 2012, and for that I will say we can also add 2009 to that we want to replace. Can we use your system while the other system is running so we can phase it out rather than replace it all at once? And combined with that question, we have another question. If we want to migrate to Dynamics 365, is it better to move to Dynamics 365 and then replace the EDI solution? With that specific question, I will ask Brian to answer that one.
Okay, great. And actually, I field that question quite often, and the short answer is it depends. But the advantage of our solution is everything that I've just showed you works with both 2009, 2012, as well as Dynamics 365. So it's the same code set from our side. You manage and set up partners once. You set up communications once. What's different is how we physically make the connection. Again, in those older versions, you would use AIF. With Dynamics 365, you use, the OData, with the REST APIs. So there is a little bit of testing that you need to do in those conversions. But I've seen organizations that, again, they're spending a lot on transaction fees. They're in non-compliance with their trading partners. They're not able to onboard new business partners. And so as they were building the business case for change, for them, they just couldn't wait for an upgrade to Dynamics 365. So most cases, again, that's often what we saw. But again, each business is going to be different. Roger and I would be more than happy to have individual conversations to talk through your specifics.
All right, thanks for that, Brian. And together with that question is, how much effort would it be to migrate EDI from Dynamics AX to Dynamics 365?
Yeah, so for
you can talk to as well?
Yeah, for our customers, that migration has been pretty minimalistic. Again, there is some testing that obviously needs to happen, and so as we go through, setting up of the data entities and going through the testing process, but depending on the number of partners, etc., potentially that can be done, quite frankly, in a matter of days, in some cases even hours. What we always want to go through is more of a specific of how many partners, how many documents, are there modifications that you maybe have done that may or may not need to get carried over. So each individual situation is going to be a little bit different. But again, if you think about the notion of, this whole customization approach, the value of having our platform is, you're not redoing, the majority of the work. So the trading partner setups, the communication, the exception reporting, all of that core infrastructure is exactly the same. And that's one of the reasons that I think customers, elect to use our solution over a customization is, quite frankly, some of the changes that occur. Microsoft continues to invest extremely heavily into this platform. When I came into the community, it was just right around AX version 4, and AX 2009 introduced, I think at the time, 1,500 new features. 2012 basically doubled the code set. 2012 R3, let alone R2 and in between and R1, but R3 really significantly changed the overall inventory and warehouse management functionality. Again, oftentimes heavily impacted with EDI. And then now with the technology platform, with the cloud deployment and the architecture there. So, EDI has to keep up with all of that. Most businesses, that's not within their core competency. The fact that, they can partner with data masons who specializes in EDI, specializes in dynamics, for many businesses, was the right business decision for them.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Brian. We just had another question coming in just now from one of the attendees, and it's once again related to the fact that the environments are all moving Dynamics 365 into the cloud, and this question is related to that, stating that if we want to run the system on premise and later on we want to move to the cloud, would that be a possibility with the Vantage Point's EDI solution?
It absolutely would, and we actually see that, interestingly enough, a fair amount. Again, for whatever reason, there is a little bit of expense to the Azure environment, but yes, absolutely, our deployment allows for that kind of flexibility. The other thing that we'll sometimes run into that hasn't come up here in this call is, I may have my local Australian deployment that's on 2012. I've got my Europe deployment on 2009, and everyone is kind of moving over to 365. That may be a multi-year kind of rollout. A single instance of Vantage Point can actually talk to multiple instances of Dynamics, each with their own version. So again, some of that kind of architecture is there as well. So again, this was really designed for the enterprise level, customer that again, has some of these more complex, kind of scenarios. But again, also supporting, the smaller organization that just their volume has grown where they have to have integrated EDI.
All right. That's pretty clear, Brian. Thank you. That were all the questions we had from right now. So I'd like to thank all the attendees for asking those questions. However, if there are any additional questions you have or pop into your mind after this meeting, or that pop into your mind if you're listening this via the recording, feel free to reach out to myself with those questions, and myself or Brian will be happy to answer those questions regarding your EDI requirements for now and in the future.
Yeah, and I, too, would like to thank everyone. I also wanted to invite you to go to datamasons.com. You can see on the lower left /Dynamics 365. We actually have a white paper that kind of takes some of the concepts that I covered here today and kind of takes it to a deeper level. So again, if you're thinking about some of the technologies we've talked about or considering, maybe purchasing a solution, there's some great resources out on our website, things like a list of, it's a partial list, but a list of, some of our trading partners that we support, customer reference videos, white papers, brochures. So there's a wealth of knowledge that we've built over the years out there. And again, as Roger indicated, we're here to personally follow up and, walk through any questions that you have. But with that, I again thank everyone for attending here today. And with that, Adam, I'll turn it back over to you or to Jason.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you also to Roger for presenting today. We did record today's event. We'll be making that available soon. And thanks to you in the audience for your time and attention. With that, we will wrap up today's event, and that concludes it. Have a great day, everybody.